are recording this webinar, and we will make it available, as well as the slides, on the Center for Suicide Prevention's website, and we will send an announcement out and a link when that information is available. All participants for the webinar are in listen-only mode, so if you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat box at the bottom of the right-hand side of your screen, and we will have an opportunity to ask Dave questions at the end of the webinar. And I think that's all I need to tell you right now. So I'd just like to take a minute to present to introduce our speaker today. He is Dave McLeod, a clinical psychologist with Western Psychology Services. Dave has worked as a volunteer at the Distress Center in Calgary and at a variety of adolescent treatment centers around the world. And he is a consulting trainer with the Center for Suicide Prevention. So at this point, I will let you take it away, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Patty. Can everyone hear me? Type if you can. Okay, good. I want to first of all thank you for coming and being willing to spend some time with us this afternoon. This is a topic that a lot of you have asked for, not just a lot of teachers, but a lot of students as well have asked for that. And one of the things that I'm going to tell you right off the top is that I am kind of afraid to do this workshop today. And the reason why I'm afraid is because of all the topics that we have done in this series. This topic begins to create elements of emotion, elements of morality, elements of a connotation in a way that other topics haven't been so loaded in. So I struggled a lot with what I was going to do with this presentation, and I decided that really the first fact or the first point that I wanted to put into place is that the language of sexuality can be a real confound in trying to help suicidal people, young people, people of any age. There is so much language, there is so much terminology, and in fact, some of you may have heard of lavender linguistics, for example, this whole kind of an area where there's a language of sexuality, a language about sexuality, almost code talk that people of sexual minorities may use to talk in a way that helps them to avoid the kind of pressures and the oppression that can come from society in general. So that I thought needed to be the starting point for all of this. There's so much potential in the language to get in problems with it. And I see it as basically two things that cause that problem, what I call denotations and connotations. To start with the denotations, the dictionary definitions of words. One of the things that becomes clear is that there are so many terms, and there are increasing numbers of terms, of categories. That Wordle picture that I put up a minute or two ago showed you a whole bunch of different kinds of categories of sexualities that are increasingly narrow and increasingly specialized. They are focused on elements of difference rather than commonality. I've talked about in this particular slide the element of a string, the string of letters, which many of you would have heard of before, which commonly gets shortened to LGBT, and that's the term that we've used. But there's almost a sort of the more that the whole area of alternate sexualities becomes increasingly specialized and defined, and more separation occurs. There are some elements who almost lobby to try to get these categories onto the string, or what I'm jokingly calling the string. And yet we wonder, for example, why is it that L and G merit separate treatment when both are same-sex orientations? The only difference is one is male and one is female. So there tends to be this movement to kind of continue to split and separate and categorize and compartmentalize sexual minorities. That can be a problem for us. Also, There are problems with what I will call connotations, and this is probably the most difficult part of all. The word homosexual is a good example of that. That's a word that does not come easily off the tongue. Homo is a Greek prefix that means the same. Hetero is a Greek prefix that means the other. So in pure linguistics, homosexual means nothing else than same sex. But when we say that word, we often feel like there's a bit of a tone to it. There's a bit of an insult to it, to the point where one of my colleagues in the room was telling a story last week about how difficult it is to go into a grocery store and take homo milk off the shelf and call it homo milk. And I experience that too. We tend to prefer to call it whole milk because there's something about the word homo that just offends us. Queer is another great example. I am of a generation of people for whom the word queer meant strange or odd or peculiar. And it went farther than that. It meant bad. And for the longest time, most of the last century, the preferred word for homosexual orientation has been gay. But somewhere around the 1980s, 1990s, people began to say that the word gay, which also means happy and carefree, was so not the right word to be using to characterize the homosexual experience. And people began to try to reclaim the term queer. So there can be a disconnect there between generations. For one, it may be a comfortable term. For another, it may not. Just another thought about that, and this is really to the point. Picture an exchange between a teacher and a student, where the student, is openly identifying with homosexual orientation. If the student says, "I am queer," that sounds very different than the teacher saying, "You are queer." When the content of the sentence is exactly the same, the only thing that's different is who is doing the saying. And I guess the point I want to make is when we're talking about connotations, the connotation typically comes from the hearer. And if we're talking to somebody about their sexuality, that's where the definition of what our conversation is going to take place. That's where it has to come from. We have to use the student's sensitivities, the student's language, the student's understanding, the student's comfort. That's what governs the exchange. Homophobic is another term that I want to just make quick mention about. It probably began in the first instance with the belief that people who are against homosexuality are phobic because they don't understand it, and if they just understood it, then they wouldn't be so afraid of it. But then you started to see, just like I did, the T-shirts, the posters, the Jerry Falwell things that said, "I'm not homophobic, I just think it's wrong." And people latched onto that word phobic about being fear. And nowadays, when you look in dictionary definitions of homophobic, you don't find the element of fear anymore. It's now more about being averse to what it represents. That's another kind of an odd term. The last one that I think is really kind of eyebrow raising is the term assignment, gender assignment. And we do gender reassignment surgeries. The term assignment implies when you give an assignment, if you're a teacher and you give an assignment to your student, you do that as somebody who is in a position of authority or superiority. So what do we say about gender assignment? That some force or divine element beyond human experience assigned us a gender and got it wrong? I mean, there's no comfortable way to talk about the transition, the gender transition, and we struggle for a good word for it. And assignment is a common one. But there's some awkwardness to the language, so we have to be super sensitive about how we talk around these subjects. And that kind of leads to the second point, and how this all relates to suicidality, because this is really the focus of what we're talking about today. That the suicidal person may also feel compartmentalized and misunderstood and defined by characteristics that are not necessarily of their own choosing. It's other people's opinions and attitudes. This whole topic is full of dichotomies, male and female. Of course, now we have discussion about transition from male to female or from female to male, or intersex even, where people have elements of both physically. sex and gender. There is some movement in literature to use the word sex to refer to the biological, to the body, to the physical, and gender to refer to behavior or thinking or roles. And certainly the DSM, I imagine most of you know what that is, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. But they're moving in that direction. That said, you're just as likely tomorrow to open up some sort of a journal article and start reading about sexuality and find that those two terms are reversed. So there isn't a consistency there. The term normal, normative, normal. This is a term that comes from math, from frequency, from statistics. Something that is normal is nothing else than the most common thing. And something that is abnormal is an uncommon thing. So in a pure linguistic sense, heterosexuality is normal, homosexuality is abnormal. But when I use those words, you don't hear common or most frequent. You hear healthy or unhealthy because we have so contaminated those terms. And so that's where we start to get into healthy and sick and the dichotomies in there. For those of you who do pay attention at all to things like the DSM, it has recently been written, as you likely know, and the term gender identity disorder has been taken out, and it has been replaced with gender dysphoria, not gender dysphoric disorder, but gender dysphoria, which represents the condition of the individual who feels disenfranchised or really disintegrated with their own sexuality. And it absolutely belongs in that book, even though it's not maybe to be considered a disorder, but there is absolutely a psychiatric process that's involved in the whole gender transition that takes place. I'll talk about that if there's time in a minute. The whole notion of right or wrong begins to get into the ethics and the morals of sexual behavior. And one last dichotomy I wanted to draw attention to is the difference between sexual orientation and sexual identity. We use the string LGBT, and this is just me personally, not as an expert, but I bristle a bit when I think of that, because to me, T is very different from G, L, and B. The dynamics and the experience of transgender, very, very different from the sexual orientation experience. There's a lot of commonality, but there's so much more. And of course, the worst kind of dichotomy is the us versus them, that other people are somehow different from me. That also echoes to our talk about all suicidal people, that often there is a sense of being disenfranchised, of being powerless, of being apart from others, of being alone and being disconnected from other people, regardless of sexuality. So that's something that we want to be mindful of. The third fact that I'm put up, and I'm going to show you a few slides here, I'll just flash through them, but basically I think I'm going to be telling you stuff that you already know, and that is that people of sexual minorities have higher rates of suicide, all across the board. And one of the things as I put these up for you to browse as I'm talking, one of the things that you'll notice is that particularly the transgender experience seems to be an extremely high risk group and a high risk struggle. There's some thinking that society in general has moved to a point of much greater acceptance of homosexual orientation, but still has a lot of discomfort with the whole idea of transgender. The transgender, just a quick couple of thoughts about that. I'll go back one more time to the DSM, and I'm not trying to flog the book by any means, but we get something from what they've written about gender dysphoria. They've given some indication that the incidence of gender dysphoria would be something on the order of about 0.005%. So if we do a bit of math in our heads, if you've got a high school of, say, 1,000 students, that would say that you might have as many as, say, 5 students in your high school. Now, those of you who work in high schools might go through your whole career, and would you have seen any openly declared transgendered students? Maybe. Over a number of years, you're bound to see some, and increasingly that's happening. I have a magazine article which you might try to look up. I don't know whether you can see this or not. It is the Maclean's magazine. It's an article that occurred in what's in fact the whole issue from January 20 of 2014, just this year. The front page cover says, "What happens when your son tells you he's really a girl?" It's all about the increasing presence in the school system. And they're saying that people, some parents, for example, are seeing even in toddlerhood that some of their children are beginning to, the term I'll use is cross-identify. You may see some of this in elementary school. Certainly by junior high, you're a little bit more likely to see it, although it can shift a little bit. Transition from male to female, more common, not just by a little bit, but by a lot, like not even twice, but maybe 3 or 4 times as common. And yet there's some indication that by the high school years, if people are identifying either as gay or as transgender, it may be more the females who are doing that, and that may be a function of how much pressure there is on adolescent males for boys to be boys. There's some indication that, for example, GSAs, gay straight alliances, if they start up in schools, they tend to have predominantly female, membership for quite a long time until they really take hold. So there's some thoughts in there about that. The fourth point, and this is probably one of the most important things I think that we want to try to understand, is that people do not suicide because of their sexuality. They suicide because of the experience of their sexuality. It's because of what happens. It's the way that they struggle to dovetail with the expectations of the rest of society. And for this next little series of slides, I'm drawing very heavily on a study or a survey that was done across Canada with students where they talked about their experience around sexuality within their school settings. And they identified a number of different things. First of all, they were saying that they were hearing a lot of comments that people thought maybe were innocuous, and yet they're hurtful kinds of comments that are thrown out, things like "that's so gay," that they're hearing this kind of talk all the time. I don't know if that surprises you or not. This one troubled me a little bit, though. They're hearing this talk from teachers as well. Maybe not tons of it, but some anyway. And they're also experiencing other kinds of verbal harassment. Look at the that 74% of transsexual students. Here comes the transsexual identity as well, coming in again, much higher targeting of that. And not only that, but people whose parents are identified as sexual minorities also get razzed about that. And they're getting beaten up in the parking lots as well. There is physical assault still going on, much more than we want to see. This is about the bullying. Sexual harassment, and how is that any different than some of the other things that have been talked about? Some examples of that would be the boy in the locker room where the other boys yank the towel away after the shower and mock him for his genitals and razz him about giving oral sex and that kind of stuff. Sexual harassment. And this one is particularly of interest. Students are saying they don't feel safe in their schools. And in fact, they're going past that. They're saying there are particular places in the schools that they don't feel safe. And they're identifying 2 places mainly. There's one other that sometimes gets added into that, and that is school buses that don't necessarily fall directly under the umbrella of the school itself, but are also perhaps less supervised. And one of the important elements in this is that they're both gender segregated places. So what can we do to help this? I'm proposing that there are a few different angles where we have some research that says that some of this can be improved. Starting with policies. Now, I'm going to say right off the top, I in no way intend in this webinar to tell you what policies you should have in your school. That's not my place at all. There are political sensitivities, there are community standards, all of that has to be factored in. The students' well-being, all of that has to be included. But we do know that some places where there have been policies put in place, there have been some important learnings about how that impacts bullying and suicide rates. Let's start with anti-homophobia measures. Schools that have clear anti-homophobia policies or charters of rights within their school system see some reduction in that kind of behavior. Teachers who are doing in-services on sexuality issues find that tends to improve sensitivity in the general climate in the whole school. LGBT inclusive curriculum. which presumably is mainly in the social studies, family studies areas. Those are the most obvious places where those get included. Um, uh, Students who are going to university in preparation to become teachers, who do some sensitivity training, we have some research that says that does tend to carry over into their teaching once they get hired into the jobs. And one really big one that's all over the news in Alberta lately is the whole notion of gay straight alliances, GSAs. And really on this list, that's the one that probably has the biggest measurable impact in reducing suicide rates and bullying. Now, it's controversial right now, as lots of you would know if you've been paying attention to the news, but there's some indication, there's lots of studies, some of them very new, that are coming out that say you might be able to cut this behavior down as much as half. Consulting with community organizations can also be very useful, and paying particular attention to vulnerable students. Now, if you've got a boy in your school who is acting in a very effeminate manner, you may want to pay attention to that boy. And before you jump all over me and say, but an effeminate boy doesn't mean a gay boy, I'll say, yes, of course not. But an effeminate boy could be a targeted boy. And that's what we're worried about. It's not so much the sexuality as the experience of sexuality that causes the problem. So I'll say that again. And the last one, which I talked about a little bit, is single occupant washroom facilities. With the transgender situation, if you've got, say you've got a boy who is cross-identifying as a girl, dresses as a girl, lives as a girl, has a girl's name, wants to use the girl's washroom, there's a potential problem there, because it might be fine as far as that student goes to allow that to happen, but then there's all the other girls who use the girls' washroom who are weirded out by it and don't like that. One solution that a lot of schools have tried to adopt is to find single occupant washrooms in the school, and most have them, and most of the time, quite frankly, they're together with they're usually teacher washrooms, or maybe in a nurse's area or something like that. That can be a good solution. The downside of that is that can further stigmatize the individual, who is now no longer seen to be a girl or a boy, but now there's some risk that students might start to refer to that student as an it, because it's like that student doesn't belong in either. However, that seems to be really the best kind of solution that many schools have been able to come up with. As far as communication goes, there's a list of different sort of ideas or sort of philosophies on how we can help communication. And this is communication that applies to all suicidal people, regardless of sexuality. It's about meeting the person where he or she is at, about being respectful, letting them set the tone, about responding to their needs and being gentle and respectful in how we communicate with them. Also, the important part is the very last part, about avoiding comparisons to other people. And that leads us to this last point that I want to make. Suicide is an individual decision, and sexuality is a very individual experience. And as much as we identify that suicide or that sexuality, the categories and types and whatever, to me, the definition of the definition of prejudice is that we can't that we assume that everybody as part of a category has all the elements of that category. The person who is the expert about the experience of suicide is that student that you're talking to. We try to meet them where they are at, rather than forcing them to meet us where we are at, forcing them into our definitions of sexuality. We meet them there to talk about their experience, and that's a principle that affects all of our work with suicidal people. All right, that's all the slides that I've got. Now, I'm aware that we've had some tech glitches. I hope we haven't lost all of you. I know that I think you haven't had to look at my face. You're probably happier about that. But anyway, I'm open now. If we want to look at some questions, I'm happy to see if I can try to talk about that. I know one question that came up partway through the experience was one about the term completed suicide uh, as an acceptable term. We have heard, we've had lots of discussion about this over the years about what's the best way to talk about the act of suicide. We've gone from committed suicide, and we've said, well, committed suicide is not a great expression because in modern language, the term committed is usually followed by either committed sin or committed crime, and suicide is neither. So let's see if we can get away from that. Completed suicide, yes, it's still getting to be a little bit clumsy. Suicided has become a bit of a verb, or died by suicide. I'll say again, what we're about here, I think, is trying to be sensitive to the people that we are talking with and trying to recognize how things are being heard. That's a whole connotation point that I was making before. The connotation happens at the level of the hearer. And so we try to be careful about the language that we use so as not to offend or distort what we're trying to say. I hope that helps. If you have any other questions, feel free to type some in.
Thanks, Dave. We have some people typing here, so we'll just give them a second to type out and see if we've got some questions. We have had some people indicate that they've lost audio on and off, and I apologize. But for the majority, I think most people have heard the presentation in its entirety. So just a reminder for those that are having some difficulty, we will send out a link to the recording, and so you can go back and revisit it if there was some information that you missed. Any questions for Dave?
Okay, lots of them starting to come. Give me a second, if you will. I'm just going to scroll back through the comment box.
Just while you're formulating some responses there, Dave, Jim asked about the slides. The slides will also be provided in the link to the recording, so you'll be able to access that as well.
Normalizing LGBT, oh, it went by fast, terminology, something about destigmatizing. Let me see if I can find it again. What was the question? It was TJ.
Does normalizing, stigma include desensitizing all terminology, Dave?
And now that in some ways that feels like a bit of a broad question. I guess what I would say about that is I would refer all the conversations that we have as you know, I saw the list of the people that are participating. Many of you are teachers, some of you are administrators, some are OTs and whatever. All the conversations that we have with individuals, we try to convey an attitude of acceptance so that we ourselves are not conveying stigma, recognizing that stigma is out there in a big way in society, and we can only do so much about that. One of the nightmares for people who are struggling with sexualities in a society that tends to oppress them is that they often feel like the only way that they can be happy is for other people to change, and that's such a powerless feeling to be able to do that. And so as much as we're able to help people see whatever elements they may be able to change within their own experience, within their own sphere, to chunk things down a little bit so that it's not taking on such a big, overwhelming kind of presence, recognizing still that they could be hearing the kinds of language that we saw, or on social media, on Facebook or whatever, they could be getting bullied or whatever, and we certainly want to try to address that, but there's only so much we can do to shut down the rest of society in their negative attitudes. So some other questions are starting to come. I'll see what I.
Yeah, Dave, there was a question about how to support young children when they are identifying as the opposite sex.
Young children, presumably meeting even as young as preschool or certainly elementary school age, and one of the key elements here always, and I hesitate to start into this one, has to do with the parents. What kind of an attitude of acceptance do we get from the parents? I mean, the general thinking seems to be, and I recognize that as soon as I talk about this from a research point of view, there are going to be a whole lot of people who will morally disagree with some of this. Um, but the idea seems to be, first of all, to not draw excessive attention to it. And quite frankly, there's all kinds of research that says that lots of young children will cross-identify, and later on in adolescence will revert to their original assigned gender. That this is often, for many, is an experiment of testing where they belong in society. So we don't want to overreact to it. In your schools, you're not going to see people who have had transgender surgeries, or not full genital surgery anyway. In rare occasions, you might see instances in high school where you've got people who have had hormone injections or possibly breast reduction surgery to try to live as the opposite gender. But for the most part, we try not to draw attention to it and allow it to play itself out. Other questions?
So Dave, we have another question with regards to suggestions for where to direct kids for help if they don't want to talk to their friends, families, and
Depending
teachers.
on the age of the children, how accessible they are to talking, in a sit-down counseling kind of design. But I would certainly be looking to whatever kind of resources you've got in the community outside. Now, again, if you're talking about students, children, parents have to be in on this. But you may be able to take advantage of whatever kinds of community-based services there might be, who might be able to support the struggle at least, and kind of give them some guidance in terms of the kinds of behavior that they're facing. Just had another question handed to me. Will there be a list of other resources, books and articles, etc.? The quick, easy way to find a real good source of information about this would be to check the CSP website and link yourself into the library of resources there. And really, this is such a burgeoning topic. There's so much stuff coming out, so that there's lots and lots of stuff. There's a question, I'm not sure if I fully understand it. The LGBTQ string, I assume that's what it is, the 5-letter string rather than the 4-letter string. And is there any kind of important significance to that? I think Q has been added to the string, and in some ways, some of these letters, like T, they can serve, for 2 or 3 different categories, and Q can represent questioning and can also represent queer. Yes, you do hear that more commonly. The 5-letter string comes quite often as well for questioning, and that certainly is being recognized as something that lots of students are going through and trying to sort out their own sexuality.
Dave, we've had a question too about suggestions as to an approach you might take to change the culture of a school with regards to accepting students who...
Accept, not accept. I don't think we want to accept people. There's an inclusion. Well, I already said when I was talking about policies, one of the big things that is having a lot of impact is GSAs, gay straight alliances. And even though there's some debate about, well, are the only people that join gay straight alliances people that are already declared, or then if you start taking part, then is everybody going to think that you're gay, and so does that keep boys away? And there's some very good research that came out just within the last couple of months from BC that said you really don't generally see the effects of GSEs until probably the 3rd year, certainly the 2nd year. But that it's not just within the GSA that the culture changes, but it begins to spread throughout the entire school. I haven't heard of GSAs in elementary schools, but maybe they're there. But certainly I've heard of them in junior high and especially in high schools. And there's resistance largely on the part of adolescent boys to that, the kind of the last bastion of the macho image, I guess. So. What else have we got? I mean, there's good discussion here. In fact, I'm not really answering these questions so much as you are. So, just watching to see if.
So Dave, there was also a question with regards to, oh, there we go. Somebody has said that the ATA has a getting started package for GSAs. Okay, any more questions or comments?
Somebody, Robert, it looks like you've had some students sitting in on the webinar today. I hope that's been helpful. We do get requests, by the way, for, oh, and Carolyn as well. Looks like that's the same thing. Maybe I got that mixed up, but anyway. We do get requests from teachers for topics, and we've been also getting some requests from students as well. So this has been a topic that people have been asking about for some time. And we may find, I mean, it's a big enough topic, we may find it come around the new year, we'll add it in as a topic to add some more to it. But we're always happy to hear what your thoughts are as well. Oh, Marion, interesting question. If bullying is a general problem. If I understand this correctly, do we want to focus on the sexuality element, or do we risk stigmatizing people, and are we better off to take it on as a bullying, a non-specific topic bullying issue? I'm not going to speak as an expert on this. My instinct is that I would be looking I would do both for starters. I think GSAs are a great idea personally, but I would also be looking at bullying behavior in general. If it's spilling out way beyond issues of sexuality, it needs to be addressed. So I know that's kind of a cop-out to say both, but I think I would be looking at bullying in general needing to be addressed as well. Okay, well, if Marion's happy with my answer, then I'm happy with my answer. By the way, I noticed we've got people from even down in the Maritimes today. Thanks for spending time with us. It must be quite late in the day for you. So we sure appreciate it if you're still online. It's been great of you to come. Right. Yes, Liv. Interesting comment. Well, okay, we've kept you a long time. Thanks for all your interest, and I guess we better wrap up. We'll be back on in a month, and we're going to take on the topic of depression and anxiety in young people, and how that dovetails with risk of suicide. So it'd be great if you'd come back and spend another bit of time with us next month.
Right, Dave. So thanks. We will be forwarding the link to the recording and also a feedback survey as well. And we'd ask that you take a minute to complete the surveys. This information is required by our funder, and it allows us to go ahead with these webinars and provide them to you at no cost. So please take a few minutes when you receive the survey link to actually provide some feedback to us. Dave's already given you the information for our next webinar on May 21st. If you are not on one of our distribution lists, either contact me here at ACICR or the Center for Suicide Prevention, and we'll make sure you get added to the list. So thank you, Dave, to you and your colleagues at the Center for Suicide Prevention, and good night, everybody.